Hi, everyone. Welcome back to Current Affairs Unfiltered. This week, we're tackling a topic that I find endlessly intriguing: dating across party lines. Coming from a family with a liberal mother and a QAnon-believing father, and having personally dated Republicans, this is something that I think about a lot. We live in an era of extreme political polarization, and at the same time, our generation is having less sex than any generation before us. Is there a connection? I have to assume that some of it is the Dobbs decision and a steady rollback of bodily autonomy as well. There's also this bizarre side of Twitter that insists that all Democrat men are betas and all liberal women are unattractive, and yet somehow Republican men seem to love dating liberal women. The dynamics here are weird, hard to pin down, but absolutely worth unpacking. Here to help us is Abby. Abby runs the YouTube account Political Psych with Abby, a channel about the psychology of politics aimed at activists and the general public. In her day job, she does psychology and behavioral science research and teaching. She has a master's in political psychology and has done activism and campaign work in the UK and US, primarily around climate issues. Without further ado, here is my conversation with Abby. Abby, thank you so much for coming on.
Thank you for having me.
Of course. So I'm wondering if you could start out just kind of broadly and talk about what role does political alignment play in attraction or compatibility between partners?
Yeah, sure. So it's hardly the biggest thing. There are a lot of things like physical attractiveness, personality that I would say almost definitely play a bigger role that I'm not an expert in. Not that I'm necessarily the world's biggest expert in the political alignment and dating, although I know a fair amount about that. But, those other things probably play a bigger role, but political alignment does play some role. You can see that both in real life patterns. People are more likely to date people who share their political party, and they're more likely to date people who generally share their politics. But you can also see that experimentally. So it's not purely correlation, although a lot of it is just based on you probably live around and hang out with people who share your politics a little bit more, right? But some of it is a bit more causal, I think, because if you do experiments, you can show someone, oh, here's this person, rate their attractiveness, or you could show this person and say, hey, this person belongs to the opposite political party as you, or disagrees with you on this issue, rate their attractiveness. And in those studies, the attractiveness and some other factors tend to be rated a bit lower once people are told that this person disagrees with them.
That's really interesting. I feel like that's exemplified, like when I was on dating apps and I'd see that, how it lists political ideology, I'd scroll and see they were, conservative. And I'd be like, okay, well, instantly, I'm not finding you as attractive as I did.
There's definitely some indications that the tendency to not date across party lines is increased by dating apps because, it's just there, right? Whereas in real life, it depends on the context in which you meet someone, but it could take you until the fourth or fifth date to find out about their politics, right?
Right. Yeah. So I'm wondering if you could talk a little bit about how dating across party lines has evolved over recent years. Speaking from experience, my mom is liberal, my father is Republican, but when they met in the early 90s, I personally think that maybe those strenuous big tensions that we see now weren't so much there, but now I think it's a lot more prevalent. So I'm wondering if you could share your ideas on that a little bit.
So in recent years, at least in the American context, dating across party lines has decreased. Like I was saying, I think some of that is due to dating apps. However, I think a lot of it is also due to the political environment and increasing polarization in society in general, especially polarization on gender lines.
Right. And are there any psychological factors that might make people more open to dating across party lines or less likely to dating across party lines?
Oh, that is such a good question. I don't actually know, but that is a really interesting question. So my default answer would be a personality trait like openness to experience. But the thing is, I haven't seen a lot of studies that are looking at openness to experience specifically in this context, although I would love to see them. And if any of your listeners know about them, please find a way to send them to me because I want to read them. But the thing is, openness to experience is also a trait that's higher among liberals. And liberals, especially liberal women, in a lot of cases are actually less likely to want to date across party lines. So perhaps openness to experience isn't the one, but it is the one that you would ordinarily look at, I think. Being less interested in politics is probably a pretty big factor.
Oh, really?
Yeah. I don't know if I've seen like literature that addresses this specifically, but generally people who are less knowledgeable about politics a lot of the time are sort of a bit less polarized. If they're less knowledgeable in terms of that they have less overall knowledge, not less knowledgeable as in they have a lot of wrong knowledge.
Right. So do you think maybe it's more likely to see people dating across party lines if somebody's super staunchly, say, Democrat, but they're dating somebody who's just not as politically involved? Like, would that still be considered dating across party lines?
I will say that one of the studies I was looking at was saying, oh yeah, and a huge fraction of, these cross-partisanship couples are people from one of the two major political parties in the US dating an independent.
Interesting.
Independents are really tricky from a political psychology perspective because you have no idea what that means in terms of like their actual ideology a lot of the time, because I think often there's this like unfortunate tendency to categorize independents as like, oh, they must be in the middle. But that's not really true in a lot of cases.
Right.
In a lot of cases, they align with one party on one thing and one party on another thing, or they think both parties are bad, or they just hate the party system or want to be seen as unique. Right. There's so many things about independence. So it's hard to say in those relationships where it's someone who's a member of one of the major political parties partnered to an independent, it's hard to tell how much political disagreement and on what issues actually exists within that relationship.
Right. Yeah. I mean, my mom was pretty independent for years and years and years until the recent, kind of chaos happened. So, I mean, I see how that, works out. What do if it's true independence with each other, is that typically more successful?
So in terms of the level of success within relationships and politics, there's only a couple studies for this that I've read and I know a lot about. And my background is political psychology. I'm not like a relationship counselor. So I don't want to speak out of turn on that. What I will say is sort of the bigger the disagreements, the bigger the chances for potential conflict. Also, the more politically intense times, the more potential there is for conflict. So I would say it has to do with how much you disagree, right? Like if two people are independents because they both sort of think both parties are bad, and let's say they both land in the middle or they're pretty similar, I wouldn't expect a lot of conflict. But if both people are independents because one person thinks the Democrats aren't far enough to the left and one person thinks the Republicans aren't far enough to the right, that sounds like a high conflict relationship, probably.
Right. Right.
Yeah.
Right. Well, yeah. So again, it just goes back to where on the independent spectrum that you fall.
Yeah. And I would also say that it probably matters a lot what issues are relevant and what issues come up in someone's particular relationship. Right. I think one of the reasons that a lot of this stuff has become more pertinent lately is because of threats to women's reproductive rights. And I think there are a lot of women out there who aren't that political, but who have a quite reasonable line in the sand of, I will not date anyone who doesn't respect my rights to my body. Right.
Right. Right. Yeah. Well, and that's totally understandable, especially given, the stories that have come out of women dying because of lack of access to care. Like, I think it's important to a lot of women to want to be with somebody that's going to respect those boundaries.
Yeah, exactly. So I think that in some relationships, that's going to have a lot more bearing on the level of conflict in relationships than certain other issues. And circumstances can make things more or less relevant, right? Like, I have a family friend who I think when her relationship with her now ex-husband started, neither of them was that politically invested. He was a bit more conservative than her, but wasn't a big deal. Neither of them was that involved in politics. They were consistently nice to each other. They had a bunch of the same interests, happy relationship, all that kind of thing. Nice wedding. Had a couple kids, and then he starts working at the country club with a bunch of people who are like more intensely Republican. He gets more right wing, and Trump gets elected. And he gets more right wing. And then the pandemic happens, and it turns out he's vaccine hesitant, and they have kids. So then they have to have this enormous fight about this because now it's something that directly affects them. It's a hugely pertinent issue. Whereas a couple could be, very divided on how the government allocates highway funding. And that's probably not going to cause a lot of conflicts in a relationship unless one of them is a transportation engineer. You know what I mean?
Yes. Yeah. Well, I mean, I think that just goes back to, like, I was talking about my parents. Back when they started dating, I feel like my dad was like, I'm a Republican. And my mom was like, I'm an independent but lean Democrat. And then they were just like, okay, because to them, it was just a disagreement about where money should be allocated rather than a discussion about human rights.
Exactly. And I think that that's like a lot of the time where the sort of dividing line is, because I think most people don't have a huge issue dating someone who disagrees with them on the means to an end, right? On the methods of something. But they probably do have an issue dating someone who fundamentally disagrees with their values. You know what I mean?
Right.
Yeah.
In couples that are dating across party lines, what are some of the most common conflicts or challenges that they could face?
Yeah. So this is not something that I'm basing off of the literature necessarily, but what I will say from having talked to a lot of people about this sort of thing and observed other people talking about this kind of thing, I would say that probably the number one, at least in America right now, is reproductive choice.
Yeah. I could absolutely see that.
I would say vaccines and immigration are probably pretty high up too. I would say the immigration one depends more on people's like personal circumstances as well. Yeah. But I would say it comes down to things that affect people every day and affect their relationships with other people, I think is a big part of it.
Right.
And so also it comes down to the person, what matters the most to them.
Right. Well, and like you said, what affects their day-to-day life and their relationships that they have with other people. But is it possible to navigate those type of disagreements where it is coming down to your deeply held values that do matter to your everyday? Is it even possible to get through that, or is that just a non-starter?
I don't want to say it's a non-starter because I don't want to get on a podcast and tell people to like get divorced or whatever, right? But it's certainly difficult. I think that it's important to think, that the main study I read about conflict in these relationships is that it was about conflict, not about, will they immediately dissolve? There are basic healthy relationship things about listening to each other and respecting each other and that kind of thing that do help in any dispute. That being said, I think that there are some positions one can take that are not unheard of in a political context, but could be objectively disrespectful to one's partner. And I think a lot of people don't want to be in a relationship where their rights aren't respected, right? Or exactly. Or where the rights of people they care deeply about aren't respected. I don't think it's healthy for people to be in a relationship where every day they have to argue for their own human rights.
Yeah.
That just sounds incredibly draining.
Well, yeah. And it's probably not a good sign when you're standing in front of your partner and saying, hey, I matter. My body matters. My life matters, whatever it is.
Yeah.
But yeah, totally.
And of course, I mean, this is scary shit, but there are certain instances where if you are married and you're a woman, they shouldn't, in my opinion. But sometimes doctors will want to hear from your husband about things. And it's very unfortunate, but I think there is political force behind efforts to make that a higher number of things, to give your husband more control over your body. And you don't want to be with someone, at least I don't, who actually wants to take that control.
So you hear it now with lots of women wanting to have full control of their bodies, looking to get hysterectomies or looking to get their tubes tied.
Yeah.
And a lot of the times the conversation from the doctor is, well, have you talked to your husband about this?
Exactly. Yeah. And it's like, yeah, that's just, it's kind of crazy. Like, it's a big decision, but I don't think a lot of women are making it lightly.
Well, right. And to assume that a woman hasn't previously spoken to her husband or partner, whatever it is, before they walked in and asked about a hysterectomy is crazy.
Yeah, and also, if they haven't, then that's probably a situation that you don't want to bring a baby into.
Right. Exactly.
It's completely crazy. Like, I was literally having a conversation with another woman in an art class I'm taking yesterday morning, and she was like, am I gonna, leave America in this current situation? And I'm like, I think I'm gonna stay at least for a while. Like, I'm gonna be okay. I'm not one of those people who is likely to be targeted. I'm white. I'm several generations born here. And she's like, oh, and you're married? And I'm like, yeah. And she's like, Liz, your husband's gonna look out for you if your rights get taken away. And I'm like, yeah, no, I can trust him. But I'm like, I think there are a lot of people who are in situations where they probably actually couldn't.
Right. No, exactly.
Yeah.
That's scary to think about. Like, I've
Yeah,
thought
it
about
is.
it too.
Yeah, it's just it's messed up.
Yeah.
Yeah,
Yeah.
and I think a lot of women are having to think about stuff like that, and I think a lot of them, it's making them less likely to date more right-leaning men, but for a lot of them, it's just making them less likely to date overall.
Well, there's been so many studies that have come out that said that Gen Z, I think, is having the least amount of sex ever compared to other generations. Which,
and
why would you take that risk?
Yeah, and that's just like, honestly, that makes me sad, right? I mean, if you don't want to have sex, don't have sex, right? But if you want to be having it, I think it's really sad to be in a situation where, in some cases, not unreasonably, so worried about the circumstances in which we live that they are frightened to engage in this fundamental part of the human experience. Like,
yeah,
that's really grim, actually.
Yeah. No, for sure.
Yeah.
So I'm wondering if we could switch topics a little bit and kind of talk about how much are political beliefs tied to identity, and then how does that affect their willingness to compromise in a relationship as it relates to across party lines discussions?
Yeah. So political beliefs are sort of part of our identity, right? We have a lot of social identities. We have a lot of aspects of ourselves that exist in the context of other people that inform who we are, how we think about the world, what groups we conceptualize ourselves as part of. And partisan identity is one of those. And it's pretty strong, at least in some contexts. How strong it is definitely depends on the context and depends on the person. Is also informed by other identities and other experiences we have throughout our lives. So there's no identity group that universally belongs to one political party or another. But, you know, if you are gay, you are much less likely to be a Republican, that kind of thing, right? If you're Black, you're less likely to be a Republican. If you're a white man, you're more likely to be a Republican, that kind of thing. And those are also identities that come up in the context of dating. And I think those identities are things that, especially when people are dating someone who doesn't share one or more of those identities, that can be fraught in dating situations, even before you bring partisanship into it. And if you bring partisanship into it, especially when a lot of these identities are sort of being discussed, in some cases being villainized or scapegoated in a political context, that can add complications.
Right. And why do some people see these political differences as deal breakers, whereas others are kind of like, oh, I can look past that, it's fine?
So I would say it partially has to do with how invested people are in these political identities. I also think, it matters the disagreement, what issue that's on. I also think it relates to people's level of desperation. And for all aspects of relationships, right? People have different levels of standards.
Right, yeah. So, I mean, is there like any sort of personality type that is just able to say, oh, that doesn't matter? It doesn't matter that he doesn't agree with me on X or Y? Or does it have to do with maybe upbringing or social environment?
Say more social environment, if I had to guess. There's not like a personality type that I know about that's really about looking past these things. I would say, the openness to experience, personality type, usually I think would correlate towards things like being more willing to, say, date someone from another country or who has a different religious background than you. But I am not really seeing that correlating in the political context specifically.
Right. So if people grow up in a bubble, say their whole community is Republican, does that have any effect on if they are willing to date across party lines?
I would say it probably would. I think in a lot of cases, the environments we grow up in I think they shape us in a lot of ways. And one way is that they affect what we see as normal.
Right.
So if you grow up in an environment where everyone says slightly racist stuff sometimes, you're probably not going to see it as a deal breaker if your partner does that, because you're going to think, assuming you oppose that, you're going to think, well, that's not great, but that's just what guys do or, what people do. Whereas if you grow up in an environment where that's slightly unacceptable, you're going to be like, that's completely unacceptable.
Right.
But I also think part of it is that, like, people who grew up in, say, very conservative environments and find that traumatic for some reason, be it that they have conflicts around a very religious upbringing or they're LGBT and that's not accepted or something like that, they might be extra hesitant to date someone who's conservative. So I could see, growing up in a conservative environment as having either positive or negative effects on willingness to date a conservative. I think depending on circumstances, I think where you currently live has a lot of impact. There are some people who, if they can't find someone to their political standards, will just swear off dating. I think that's something that gets talked about a lot on the internet. I would be surprised if it's actually that societally common. So I think that sometimes if you're in a particular area, you're willing to look past politics because you don't really have a lot of choices. I think a lot of the frustration, actually, that a lot of the angry articles from this kind of thing, though, are from conservative men who are interested in women and who live in largely liberal areas. That means that there are liberal men around. So the women that they want to date have choices that, at least on political grounds, they see as better. And so those conservative men don't get dates, and then they write editorials about it, or much, much, much worse things than editorials.
God. Imagine being rejected from a date and your go-to is to write an angry editorial about how you're undateable. That seems like you should look inwards.
Yeah. I do think that it is. Yeah, I mean, I think that the tendency to look outwards rather than inwards, and especially having that tendency encouraged in young men is interesting. I think it's very, very profitable to encourage that attitude.
Oh, yeah. Well, and you see it all over social media of people being like, oh, it's the liberals' fault, or even on Twitter, X, whatever you want to call it. I've seen, like you said, men complaining about not being able to get dates, or I went on a date with a blue-haired liberal and she did X, Y, and Z. Just give it a break. It's not that deep.
Yeah, I think that that's a big part of it. And I'm not going to say that there aren't serious issues affecting young men. There are, right? But the manosphere stuff is not a friggin' solution.
They're in an echo chamber. Granted, a lot of us are in an echo chamber, but their echo chamber is scary when they're constantly feeding each other these lies, I guess, about nothing's your fault. It's women's fault. It's society. Yeah. Society is built to uphold women on a pedestal. Okay.
Yeah, I mean, I might be in an echo chamber, but my echo chamber has never told me to shoot up a yoga studio or kill myself. So
right, exactly. My echo chamber is nice to me. My echo chamber tells me when stuff is my fault.
Yeah, and I don't know, it's crazy because I think that it's not just the absolute fringes. I've now had conversations with women who are struggling to date, struggling to find guys who are not just brain melted.
Right.
Yeah,
right.
And that is
a lot of
grim.
Yeah, for sure. And I feel like, did you ever hear about the internet discourse about Ballerina Farm?
Yeah, I kind of did.
So she went to Juilliard to be a professional ballerina.
Yeah.
The boyfriend followed her there.
Yeah.
Knocked her up and then was like, well, you have to drop out. And now she just lives on a farm taking care of animals. And somebody wrote a piece about her.
Yeah.
And everybody was like, this is sad. Your husband went and snuffed your light out. I'm sure they were aligned politically. They both came from heavily religious backgrounds. But I'm like, you still chose somebody that snuffed your dreams. That snuffed you being a professional ballerina.
Yeah, I don't know. I mean, with that situation, it's always been a little unclear to me, how much of it is her own choices. And if that's what a woman wants to do with her life, no judgment. Live your thing, right?
You can go tend to the chicken coop. That's not the issue. Yeah.
Yeah, and I think I'm not sure that focusing the discourse on one person's experiences is the most healthy, especially because, I think she over-glamorizes it, but I really don't think that her life is the worst possible outcome. You know what I mean?
Right. Absolutely.
I think that there are a lot of women who are, because of choices men have taken away from them, suffering a lot worse than she is and had a lot less control than she did. And I don't know. I kind of think that really focusing in on that just kind of gives ammunition to people who want to categorize feminists as crazy or categorize feminists as really judgmental of stay-at-home wives or stay-at-home moms or whatever.
Right.
And that's not where I am. If you want to do that, do that. It's just,
There's
it's just
wrong with doing it. It was, and I saw it in the discourse. There were some people that were just, shitting on her for being a farm wife, but then the what I found to be more of the legitimate discourse was that she was presenting it online as this like happy farm-loving family, but then you read the article and come to find out that like the way she ended up there was really like a tragedy of circumstances of her own making, of his own making, that was just kind of sad. And again, that's a couple that was pretty politically, or seemed as though they are pretty politically aligned, of the same faith background, of the same morals, whatever.
Yeah, no, I definitely think it's complicated. I don't know. Part of it for me is like, I don't think you can liberate someone who doesn't want to be liberated. You know what I mean? Yeah, I don't know. I don't know. The whole trad wife thing is friggin' weird.
It's so the trad wife online stuff is so hypocritical because they preach the stay-at-home mom lifestyle, but then are making money
business owners.
Exactly. They're making money off the content that they create. So you're saying it's realistic because your husband's an electrician or whatever, but then you're making money off the content that you're making. So where's that side of the story?
Yeah. And I am someone who I have the hobbies and skill set where like I could pivot to trad wife content like so friggin' easily. Because my day when I get home from work is like I spend 2 hours cooking dinner for my husband because like that's what I find relaxing. But also, you know, I really enjoy weaving and various craft projects, and I can sew and I make bread from scratch. Like I can do all of that. You can do all of that without letting go of feminists. And I think that it's a problem because I think that there are a lot of women who really enjoy a lot of these activities, which is reasonable because a lot of them are kind of nice. And there are a lot of women who hate working, which is fair because often work sucks. Right. But the solution is not being complicit in having your own rights taken away, right?
I think my kind of issue with, especially somebody who has dated conservative men, is that, you know, I also enjoy cooking. I like doing the stuff that is typically considered feminine, but I don't like when it's expected of me.
I agree entirely.
That's a big issue with conservative men is that they make it something expected, which that's what I take issue with.
Yeah, no, it's both people have to contribute to a relationship type thing. Because, I mean, and it's not just conservative men. There's a lot of data to indicate that women are still doing way more than their fair share of housework in households where the amount of work done outside the home is equal between the partners.
Oh, yeah. Well, that's growing up. My mom, she did all of the child rearing and worked a full-time job. That included travel, so she was out of the house from like Tuesday to Thursday most weeks. And then my dad was a police officer and was home for most of the time, but he didn't do the same amount of domestic labor.
Yeah.
I look back on that and I'm like, I don't want to emulate that.
Yeah, exactly. Because it's like, I'll do my fair share of the housework, but at some point, I also want to be able to sit down and watch TV or do craft projects or just have time to myself. I think that that's also a really important thing to look for in relationships is if you are looking for someone who views you as an equal, how much do they actually treat you like one? Because I think that this is a thing, right? Where like there are plenty of guys out there who will espouse feminism till cows come home, but don't actually do their fair share of housework or whatever.
Right. So just kind of moving out to look at more of the broader context of the U.S., do you think that dating across party lines can help bridge that kind of gap that we're seeing, the big polarization that we're seeing right now?
Well, maybe. But so relationships across party lines are not that common. And even in times of less polarization, they weren't the norm. So I really see them as something that's more affected by polarization than likely going to have an effect on it. I would say that spending more time with people who disagree with you in a friendly context can be a way to decrease hostility and that kind of thing. But I think that there have to be sort of limits. You know, I'm not telling anyone don't date across party lines, but I do think it's important to have your limits about what you think is and isn't okay in a partner, right? And also, we've been talking mostly about long-term relationships. I think it's reasonable if people are into the casual stuff to have different limits for the casual stuff and serious stuff, right? Like that's
definitely
fair.
Spending a month with a person is a lot different than spending a year to the rest of your life with them.
Exactly. And that's all different from, like, say, a hookup or whatever, right?
Right.
So what I was going to say is, I think it's also important to keep in mind that, like, so polarization is bad, like, politically. Like, it's not great for a country to be super polarized, but I'm one of those people who I believe very, very strongly in paying attention to the content of polarization, like what people actually disagree on, and not treating both sides as equal. Because yes, polarization is bad, but there are some instances where it is worth treating the other side as unreasonable, right?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. The last few weeks, it's gotten, and it's hard because so much of the advice from professionals, you can't point the finger and laugh all the time. You have to kind of treat some people with kid gloves in order to get them out or get them thinking. And I'm like, that's just infuriating to me, because why do I have to treat you with kid gloves when you're being so unreasonable?
Sometimes you've just got to get them out of the way, honestly.
No,
Because, like,
definitely.
I think a lot of the time, the way people talk about politics, they talk about trying to get people on side or find compromise with people who are the most diametrically opposed to you. And that's not really how effective coalitions are built for positive change, right?
Well, I think a lot of times, especially in the Trump administration, politics is seen as a zero-sum game.
Yeah.
It doesn't have to be that way.
Yeah, and I also think that it's important to realize that, like, a lot of people are not the most politically coherent. So there are people out there who, you know, are going to be not allied with you on some issue, but are going to be allied with you on something else, right? Like, the primary, like, my main thing as an activist is I do, like, climate activism, right? And I'm also fairly pro nuclear power, but that is a point of contention within the climate movement. And especially there's a lot of sort of older, like, former hippie climate activists that are very anti-nuclear. So let's say I'm going to an anti-fossil fuel protest and they're there. To bring up that I disagree on nuclear stuff, because I'm probably not going to persuade them that day. And we're showing up for the same thing that day. We're going to be cordial. We're going to give each other snacks. We're going to, be helpful to each other, that kind of thing. And I think that there are a lot of issues like that. There's a bunch of states that are red states, but also had ballot initiatives and stuff supporting people's right to choose, and those got support. I think it depends on the issues. And I personally have found it more helpful to try and talk to people on an issue by issue basis rather than, like, trying to do everything all at once.
Yeah.
Because I think a lot of the time, people's ideas on certain issues aren't fully formed yet, and you can actually influence that or have your views influenced on that.
I've said in conversations with people, there are a couple things that are very black and white for me.
Yeah.
My opinion is not changing. That is the way it is for me. Yeah. But there are a lot of other issues where it feels kind of gray to me, where my opinion is my opinion, but it's more research or conversations happen. Like, it could totally change because those aren't issues that I find, a part of my identity or part of who I am as a person.
Yeah, I think I agree with you on that a lot. And I think most people are like that, which is why, like, my suggestion for people for, dating and politics is, like, figure out what your values are and figure out where your lines are.
Yeah.
But also listen to your instincts, right? Like, obviously, if you're in a dating situation and something is making you uncomfortable, that is something to at least have a conversation about.
We talked a little bit about it in regards to dating apps, but do you think that social media has kind of contributed to the challenges of dating across party lines?
I think it has. So dating apps, I think those are the biggest factor in terms of things that are technological, whether societal change or, like, the dating apps are a bigger factor, or whether, they honestly probably influence each other. I don't know which one of those is a bigger factor. But in terms of, like, other places on social media, yeah, I think it is a factor for a couple of reasons. One of them is I honestly think that social media is generally very encouraging of isolation. So I think it sometimes discourages people from things like dating overall.
Yeah, I can see that.
And one thing that really bothers me on social media is the glorification of being an introvert, when it's like, okay, this isn't being an introvert. You have social anxiety. Please go get some help. Like, not that I'm diagnosing anyone, very importantly, not a clinical psychologist, but like, you get what I mean, right? And then the other thing is, I think that, and I just did a video about social media and political psychology where I had a former Meta employee on and interviewed him, if any of your listeners are interested in that.
I will link it in the show notes.
Okay, awesome. So social media tends to lean towards negativity and also to outgroup negativity. So outgroup is groups that you aren't a part of. If people have a bad experience dating and share it on social media, it is likely to trend and more people are likely to see it and they might get discouraged. If people have a bad experience dating across party lines or dating someone who's sort of outside of their in-group in some way and share that on social media, that is also likely to trend. And other people might find that discouraging. The thing is, I don't want to act like people are hysterical or something, right? Like, because, well, I mean, some of these stories are fake, right? Like, a bunch of internet stories are fake. That's just objectively true. But a lot of them are real or mirror something real. We do, as humans, we want to warn each other of things. We are a social species. And so I think the impulse of, like, especially as a woman right now, warning other women of, hey, this thing happened to me when I dated a conservative, maybe don't do that. That's a reasonable impulse.
The part that grinds my gears about that conversation is on social media when people be like, oh, like, I dated somebody that voted for Trump. And the comments are like, I could never date somebody that, like, disagreed with human rights. But like we just talked about, sometimes it's so much more than that. Like, I agree.
Yeah.
I would find it troubling to date somebody in the MAGA sphere because I'm of the opinion that there's a difference between Republicans and MAGAs. But to boil it all down to, I could never date somebody that was voted for against human rights, because I think it is so much more than just that.
Well, I mean, so, like, I personally probably wouldn't date someone who voted for Trump. Like, that's probably a line in the sand for me. But I think that there's always a chance, especially when you're young, that, like, you're dating someone who, like, you know, did something like that, like, a couple years ago, and they've kind of changed as a person. Maybe they haven't fully admitted that they were wrong yet, but, you know, there's always a chance that someone votes badly in an election, essentially because they're uninformed or politically incoherent rather than that they're evil. Right? Like,
well, I'm a big believer that people can change and you should give them the space to change.
Yeah, I think that is important, is giving people the space to change. I will say that, like, treating people with hostility doesn't usually help unless you need to treat them with that hostility to protect yourself or someone else, right? So, like, if people are going to take away from this conversation to reject Trump supporters on dating apps, like, that's not exactly what I'm saying, but I don't really have a problem with that. But I will say, unless they say something shitty first, don't say something shitty because it's probably just making things worse.
Yeah. Well, and driving that divide even further.
Yeah, but sometimes they do say something shitty first, right? Like, and sometimes people will, I think a lot of the time, edgelord culture extends to things like dating apps. People will put something deliberately provocative in their, you know, dating profile or whatever.
It was always the part I found the most, like, mind-blowing, because when I was on dating apps, I would make very clear, I am a Democrat, I hold those beliefs, but then conservative men would, with conservative big in their bio, would always be liking me, and I'm like, what are you doing?
Well,
because
you're
that was what
blonde.
I was trying to prevent. I am blonde. I people look at me and they're like, oh, like, she's totally a Republican. And I see it. I see why they think that.
Yeah.
Like, I am blonde, like, I am white.
Yeah.
Totally understand the misconception. But when it's very clear and right there that I am not what you are looking for, I always found it so mind-blowing.
Yeah, I mean, I think sometimes, like, conservative men's, like, categorization of women is like even more like just visual than like, and like to some extent sexual than like what those women actually say their politics are.
Well, and it's almost like I can fix her. Like, I can fix it.
Yeah. Not that you should, but like, I bet you money that if you like dyed your hair blue, this would probably stop happening to you, but you would probably also get like way worse messages from these guys.
Well, that's what, like, with this podcast, I always think it's so funny to like post videos or shorts or whatever and I look like this archetype of what a Republican woman is. And
Yeah.
guess what? Nope.
Yeah, I get what you mean because I'm also a very left-leaning woman who looks a little bit more right-leaning sometimes because I don't wear a lot of makeup, or when I do, it tends to be pretty like toned down. I dress like I have a boring job because I kind of do. My hair is usually like a pretty normal color. Sometimes I am literally wearing a dress and pearls. And so it is this sort of thing of like, okay, I'm not getting categorized a certain way because I don't look a certain way.
Right. Like performative Republicanism.
Yeah, and it's funny because it happens even stronger when I'm with my husband because I got married pretty young. When we got married, I was 24 and my husband was 23. And my husband is also white. I feel like with men, it's like less aestheticized, but you couldn't tell, right, his politics from the way he dresses.
Right.
But it's really funny because so we live in Chicago, but if we're going on vacation or whatever, there's a significant chance that we're going somewhere red or at least purple because that's kind of what's nearby. And we get treated really good. Yeah. But there's a certain extent of telling my husband hey, don't mention you're a communist and I'm Jewish. Because they're going to stop being so nice to us here. Yeah.
Right.
Yeah. But I think that there is sometimes a usefulness to not looking a certain way. As part of climate activism stuff, I do a lot of standing in public and getting people to try and sign things.
Yeah. You want to be as, unassuming as possible for something like that.
Exactly. Honestly, you want to look like the dream daughter-in-law of whatever 70-year-old is walking by. That's the thing. And even in pretty liberal areas, it still helps because I definitely have older relatives who are pretty politically left wing, but still freak out if someone has a bunch of piercings or a bunch of tattoos or something.
Well, right. And I think that's less political and just, generational.
Yeah, no, it is too. But I get what you mean. The whole not looking aesthetically.
Yeah. Okay. Moving on to more practical advice. Are there any benefits to dating somebody that has different political beliefs?
Yeah, I would say yes. And I say that as someone who is married to someone with different political beliefs, but he's to the left of me, not to the right of me. So I would say that it's that you get exposed to sort of different and new ideas, which is good and interesting. Right. I mean, to some extent, it depends on what those ideas are. That's good. I think that's part of why I suggest that people focus on values rather than on methods. Because I think if you are in a relationship with someone who has somewhat different politics than you, that can be a way to get exposed to sort of new methods of thinking about societal problems that you're like, oh, actually, I think that makes sense. And that's good, right? I think that's also why it's bad to have a one-party state, right?
Well, right. Then it's just an echo chamber and it's groupthink and there's no dialogue.
Yeah. But I also think that most people don't really love their home or, their dating life being a super high conflict environment. And I get that. I'm someone who I spend a lot of time thinking about politics, reading about politics, that kind of thing. But I have a blanket rule for my YouTube channel that I don't do debate content. Because I hate arguing with people.
Right.
So I'm also not doing that in my relationship. So, we have conversations about things. We don't really argue that much, even when we disagree, which does mean that for someone like me, because I'm very conflict averse, it's important for me to not be in a relationship where I need to be in conflict in order to be able to maintain my values and feel like I'm being heard.
Yeah. Yeah.
But someone who really likes arguing might be more comfortable with that.
Right. Yeah. I understand that. I think it does have its benefits, but I think you're right that there's the conflict can eventually grow to perhaps be too much, that it's just nobody wants a relationship where you're constantly arguing, and especially from my perspective, yelling at somebody and saying, hey, I matter, my autonomy matters, my life matters, my friends' lives.
Yeah.
One last question for you. Are there any red flags when it comes to political differences, in the beginning of a relationship that might signal deeper incompatibilities with values in the future if you choose to continue going forward?
So it's been a long time since I began a relationship, right? And also, full disclosure, I went to college in Scotland, so I haven't dated an American since I was 18. But what I would say is really just not being listened to is a red flag. Saying disrespectful things about you or people you care about, be that directly or indirectly. For example, for me, one of my best friends from growing up happens to be a trans guy, right? So if someone said something really transphobic on like a second date, they weren't deliberately trying to offend me or like something wrong to me, but that would probably be a pretty big red flag for me, because to be like, okay, I can't have you around this person who's important to me, right?
Right.
Yeah, and I would also say bodily autonomy stuff is huge, and I think that stuff is honestly something that needs to be figured out really early in a relationship.
Right.
Yeah,
because it goes so much broader than just abortion.
Yeah, it does. Exactly.
Like it is also like when I am pregnant, if something goes wrong and I'm incapacitated, what is your game plan?
Yeah,
what
it's
are
like
you going to say?
Yeah, exactly. It's just that that stuff I think needs to be figured out sooner, because you never know what can happen. And I do want to say that I've been mostly talking about this in terms of heterosexual relationships. Gay relationships are not something that, like, I'm straight, so like I don't have experience with that.
Me as well,
yes. But I think that is also something where those sorts of things need to be figured out. I think with that, probably if someone is still in the closet because of politics and you're not comfortable with that, like, that's important to think about. And obviously, bodily autonomy, body rights, things like that's not just about like women or, that kind of thing. Like, everyone has rights to their own body that need to be protected. And that's something to think about. Yeah. So those are red flags. I would also say just sort of general level of sexism is a good thing to look out for.
That's a good one.
Yeah. So I have this test that I didn't realize I was doing in relationships, which is just like offer to pay and see how the guy reacts in the context of like straight relationships. I think a lot of the time, if a guy has some sort of sexist issues, that will come up if you offer to pay. Either he'll be like, women never pay, you're one of the good ones, that's a red flag. Or you can't pay, you're the woman, which is also a red flag.
Right.
Yeah.
Yeah. So I think it is just a lot of looking out for those microaggressions. Yeah. But two, being fully aware of what your boundary is, what the line is that you're not willing to cross before you even date a guy. Because, I mean, I myself have done it where I'm like, well, it's fine that he, did this shitty thing because da-da-da-da-da. Because I didn't have clear boundaries before going into it. So I was willing to, negate some of my values because of it.
Yeah, I think that's a big part of it. I mean, I honestly think that developing what your red lines are, what your limits are, how you deserve to be treated, that kind of thing is something that takes time and something that a lot of people don't get right in their first relationships. Not everyone immediately knows to respect their own dignity.
Right.
Yeah.
Yeah. Okay, well, that is all I have for you. Do you have anything else you want to say that you feel like I missed?
I don't think so.
All right, then I will have your YouTube linked in the show notes so that everyone can go check that out. Your videos are always awesome. I find them really insightful. I stumbled across your one on dating across party lines while I was doing research for another guest, and I was like, wait, this is awesome. Thank you so much for coming on. This was a great conversation. I think is so important to today's world and so important to younger people, especially, like I said, people my age, our age, are having less sex. Yeah. Dating is strenuous and stressful, and I think it is important to, have a conversation like this and make it feel a little bit less daunting and easy to comprehend.
I realized that there was one thing I did want to add.
Yes, go ahead.
I don't think that swearing off men as a political statement makes sense.
Hot take. I agree.
Yeah. I think swearing off of men who don't support your rights is a good stance that you should take both politically and for your own self-interest.
Right.
Issues like abortion and general women's rights are not as clearly gender divided as a lot of people would think that they are. A lot of our allies in this fight are men. A lot of our enemies in this fight are women. It also conceptualizes sex as like something that women give to men and like that they don't want for themselves. It's like a service women perform, which really reinforces sexist ideas in like a very intense, very fundamental way.
Yeah.
Yeah,
no, definitely. But yeah, I agree. I think that like, right after the election, when people were like 4B movement in the US, I was, I'm just not sure.
Yeah, I will say also that the decentering men in your life thing, if women want to do that, if that's what makes you happy or feel safe or whatever, or that's something you want to focus on for a while, or even if men want to do that, if they want to take a break from dating and figure some stuff out, like that's something I totally encourage. That's reasonable. Like, people shouldn't date if they don't want to. I just don't think that it's like a political solution.
Right. Yeah, there's nothing wrong with taking a step back from dating, but the minute you're like, I'm not dating because politics, it's a little, okay.
Yeah.
Not really sure where to go from there.
Yeah.
Okay. Thank you guys so much for tuning into this episode of Current Affairs Unfiltered. And thank you to Abby for giving us a deep dive on political psych and what it means to date across party lines. And maybe it'll help you get out of that weird situationship you're in. I feel like a lot of our conversation was super insightful and made me think about my family as well as myself, and is absolutely something that I'm going to take forward into any new connections I make, whether it be romantic or platonic. If you enjoyed today's episode, don't forget to follow, leave a review, or share it with somebody who could use this information. Maybe your mom's still dating your Republican father, or maybe your friend is dating that guy that just loves to repost Donald Trump's Truth Social posts. And as always, if you have questions, topic suggestions, or just want to say hi, you can find me on social media at Current Affairs Unfiltered Pod on Instagram, or send me an email at currentaffairs.unfilteredpod@gmail.com. I'd love to hear from you. Keep asking questions, stay engaged, and remember to keep pushing forward. I will see you next time in the briefing room.